Hello everybody, my name is Isabel Padalecki and I am a senior at Davidson College studying history and gender and sexuality studies. And today I will be sharing you research I began this summer and am continuing to work on as a part of my senior honors thesis, which is entitled Growing Up and Into Excess, a Historical and Auto-Ethnographic Investigation into the Gendered, Sexualized, and Racialized Nature of Fat Embodiment. So I began this research with a general interest in the multidisciplinary field of fat studies, and I wanted to find out what fat studies is and how I could draw connections between different sources of literature, different types of theories coming out of this field, and perhaps create a literature review. And so I began with the Fat Studies Reader, which is a really important text published by Esther Rothboom and Sandra Solovey in 2009. And in this piece, Marilyn Wan writes a really impactful foreword where she says, amid such crushing social coercion and control, the field of fat studies can offer a revelatory new lens on the central human question of embodiment. Fat studies can show us who we are via the lens of weight. And with this source, I really became interested in the extent to which fat study could answer, provoke, and really dive into a lot of questions that relate to the fundamental experiences of humanity, of embodiment, of how we come to know ourselves as people through these regulatory regimes, through language, through discourse. And I really began interrogating what does it mean to embody fatness, and how fatness can thus serve as an analytical lens towards broader questions of embodiment. And so I came up with a couple research questions. First, what is fat stigma? How do fat people, including myself, experience it? Second, how have fat studies scholars and fat activists together challenged notions of fat abjection and embodied hierarchies of biological normativity? And third, to what extent do these lived experiences, including my own, at the intersections of fatness and queerness, contribute to a radical reimagining of these biological and hierarchical ways that we understand selves, subjects, and bodies? How can fatness undo these regulatory notions of humanity and of bodies that matter, lives that are worth living? To do so, I mixed three kinds of methods. First of all, autoethnography, the anthropological means through which we take ourselves, our lives, our experience as valid and important objects of ethnographic observation. Specifically, I drew from Hee-Wan Chang's 2008 autoethnography as method and Jones and Holman's 2019 queering autoethnography. Second, I wanted to write a literature review. I wanted to summarize and touch on a lot of what fat studies has done and continues to do. But I wanted to take literature review in a different direction. I read the work of Corson and Schwitzman, who wrote an autoethnographic literature review in 2018, and began to see the review of literature as an embodied and ethnographic process, as encountering a text that was created by a person whose subjectivity was forged in a certain context. And so really reviewing literature as a means of encountering the selves and bodies of others. And then number three, archival analysis. I got to visit the GLBT Historical Society Museum and Archives in San Francisco in the summer of 2021, thanks to funding from Davidson College. And I got to view a really amazing collection called the Judy Free Spirit Papers, which provides a lot of background to movements for fat liberation, fat activism, fat feminism in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, especially on the West Coast of the United States. And I took an archival approach that really doesn't try to go around or queer the archive, but rather follow yourself, the experience of being embodied in the archive and encountering archival materials through this lens of the self. And so I really leaned into what Corson and Schwitzman have called a contentious connection between experience and academic writing, and tried to lean into it as a transformative process by which we can recognize the review of scholarly and archival materials both as fundamentally embodied experiences articulated through a shifting, unstable lens of a self that is formed in a very specific discursive context. Now, in terms of theory, I had a couple pieces that were really interesting and important to me. First of all, Foucault's 1963, The Birth of the Clinic, because the clinical gaze is incredibly important when we think about fat oppression, because the medical industry is one of the primary places in which narratives of fatness as inherently diseased or trending towards death are sort of built, and yet medicine is fundamentally cultural. It is not actually this sort of like objective thing. Rather, that is a politically motivated authority. And so Foucault really draws that out and makes that clear. Then we move on to Judith Butler's Bodies That Matter, 1993. This is probably the most important theoretical text I have cited in this research because Butler really fundamentally gets into the questions of what do we constitute as a human body? What do we constitute as a body that is worth living in, a life that is worth grieving? And it's really interesting to think about the continued and visceral fat oppression that really harms people still so much to this day as a manifestation of these binary ways of constructing humanity as counterposed to an abject other, which can represent the fat body. Then I get into Samantha Murray's The Fat Female Body in 2008, and Murray really, among other things, talks about the tensions that exist in a contemporary fat subjectivity wherein we are exposed to ideas of liberation and justice and self-acceptance, etc., and yet still live under a fundamentally biopolitical regime where we come to know our bodies as objects of measurement, categorization, where science and medicine intervene to normalize, basically. Moving forward quite a bit, we get to Caleb Luna, who is currently working right now and releases a lot of work on these intersections then of fatness as embodiment as related to issues of disability, queerness, gender presentation, and really talking about fat futures in that regard. So really cool stuff. Amy Farrell's 2011 provides a really important historical context because she talks about the ways in which our understanding of fatness as an uncivilized, as an immoral, unable to be controlled body are really a manifestation of old and historically contingent notions that some bodies are civilized and rational and other bodies are not. And that's, the logic that encouraged and justified chattel slavery in the United States, as Sabrina String has argued. And so she really talks about how fat phobia in the present holds so much weight in terms of upholding regimes that deem bodies a site of assortment into normative and non-normative categories. And then Jones and Harris's Queering Auto-Ethnography 2019, of course, is my main methodological text and really talks about the radical and queer potential of taking the self as an object of inquiry and really enacting in academic research this idea of the personal as political. And so just right before I hop into my main contentions, I wanted to return to the archives just to give you a little bit more background about the Judy Freespirit papers. This collection talks a lot about Judy Freespirit, who is one of the co-founders of one of the first fat feminist liberationist organizations in the United States, the Fat Underground, which was founded in Los Angeles in 1973. And in the archives, I got a really intimate look at Judy's engagement with her own fat identity. And I really was inspired to then consider these archival sources, not just as sources of information, but rather embodied encounters with fat subjectivities in a trans-historical context. And as you can see, there's personal journals, poetry, pictures, really just a wonderful wealth of information. I'm very grateful to the GLBT Historical Society Museum and Archives for providing me with all these materials. And so now my main contentions that have come out of this project are a lot about what autoethnography, what the self means in fat studies, and especially when we take fat studies like Marilyn Wan has encouraged us to, as a site through which we can interrogate questions of embodiment and selfhood. First, I contend that autoethnographic fat studies scholarship produces alternative accounts of fat and queer embodiment that contrast the objective authority of the American medical industrial complex, which would like to construe itself as presenting truth. Fat studies undoes that truth. Number two, autoethnography provides a discursive space, a unique discursive space, in which we can reimagine fat and queer lives as fundamentally full, complex, and worth living despite it all, despite their abstraction from normative humanity, thereby queering the very notion of the embodied subject. And number three, by centering fat and queer voices, scholarship, histories, and imaginations across time and space, and including my own, we can both reveal and call into question so many biopolitical and regulatory measures of personhood, and really, in doing so, imagine for the first time autonomous fat futures and autonomous fat personhood beyond these confines of how we think of and constitute normative embodiment. And so now for the last couple minutes I have you, I'm going to dive into the text. First of all, just to show you how it's set up. It's set up into sections which represent questions that I asked myself or I was asked by others as I went down the rabbit hole of fat studies. And so I start with this question that my mother asked me when I had first started this project. And reminder, my mother is a scientist of obesity. Her work very much forms, to some extent, the counter literature that I'm speaking against. So it's kind of a fraught dynamic. And she says, fat studies, what is that? And, I really dive into telling her what I have learned thus far, which I'd read like one article about fat studies, but then I take a moment to really reflect on what I would tell her now, several months later, having done all this reading. And, it's a really important part of the lit review because I really introduce a lot of the major themes of my own personal memories that come up in the piece, my experience with Weight Watchers and calorie-restricted diets in elementary school, my absorption of my mother's sort of like conference calls in the house. And so this is sort of like the structure of the whole piece, but also it does structure the whole piece by setting up a lot of these frameworks that are generally agreed upon in fat studies, but also frameworks of my life. And then I just wanted to take you through some more specific pieces, especially wanted to show you how I use the archive and how I engage with archives as sources of knowledge and sources of embodied encounters. I wanted to read this little passage from one of my personal memory sections where I talk about my encounter specifically with this poem. And I talk about feeling haunted by this poem. And I'm going to read the poem for you. It was written by Judy Freespirit in 1977. Lynn said, I'd like to die thin. Even knowing all that I know, even knowing how dieting kills me, I'd like to die thin. There isn't much to live for anyways. And so I really speak to how I am haunted by this sense of despair and profound pain that really encounters a character, Lynn Mabel Lois, who we come to know in the archives as one of the most passionate, forward, outspoken, fat activists of the 1970s. And yet she admits that there is this part of her that still feels so wounded by coming to know herself through systems that would encourage her obliteration as a fat person. And I really lean into that complexity and I talk about why it matters so much to me. One, because it really feels difficult to come by sometimes, even in existing fat studies literature, but also because it's something that I could relate to. And I basically think about this as an early iteration of these sort of necropolitical theories that have come out in scholarly journals, etc., around fatness in the past couple years. But Lynn is doing that theoretical work here in the 1970s. And so I write, what I had read in scholarly theories of fatness as social death was written plainly on the page before me, bearing no peer review nor academic title, and yet speaking with an unspoken and powerful authority of a fat person who has endured life in a society that understands fatness as a specter of death. Theories of fat bodies as bodies that do not matter, as abject, non-human, death-bound counterparts to the supposed vitality of thin human life, did not have to be explained to me through theoretical framings. Rather, through sharing this vulnerable and terrifying moment of truth with Lynn and Judy, I understood these theories as truths I had already known within myself, my own personal history of fat abjection. I realized that I had known and understood the necropolitical workings of anti-fatness since the very first time I ever knew myself as morbidly obese and cried myself to sleep, hoping that if I would just start starving the next day, I could save myself from death by obesity. This poem, speaking with the authority of lived experiences, demonstrates clearly and urgently the stakes of fat studies. This is life or death, a literature that seeks to challenge a world where fatness is equated to death. I feel a heaviness in my chest every time I think of this poem, think of the small part of me that wonders if maybe it would, after all, be better to die thin than to live fat. I remind myself, however, that through reading this poem, I'm witnessing fat life, not death. That these fat thoughts and truths about death and dying laid bare before me the awesome power of intimate testimony, a sharing between myself and Lynn. And I go on. Yet I think that this section really ties together my method. I talk about how this embodied encounter with the archive and leaning into both the self of me and the self of Lynn really produces knowledge and produces my methodological argument. And so then the next sort of section I wanted to show you is where I really engage with Samantha Murray's text, and I talk about these feelings of being an imperfect fat activist because I'm really trying to liberate myself as a fat person, and yet I have wounds that remain from coming to learn who I am through narratives that, again, encourage my annihilation. And so I really lean into Samantha Murray's engagement with these tensions. And I really liked reading her piece because she also includes her own personal experiences. And, you know, I'm going to start reading now from this section. As I read, I realize with horror the extent to which the specter of self-love in a thin and starved body beckons to many fat adults who grew up as fat children. As I read Murray's monograph, I caught a glimpse of the small, quiet moments where she allowed her own life to slip into the academic theories she spun, telling stories of her own experiences as a fat woman living in a fat-phobic world. She allowed herself to say that despite it all, despite every self-help text written by and for fat people, queer people, instructing us on how to shake the limits that teach us to despise our own flesh, even as I loathe the discourses that position my fat flesh as pathological and wish to change them, they constitute my very being and my desire to belong. And, I really lean into this sad admission, and I say I've done so much fat studies reading, spent nights unlearning and writing and reflecting until my fingers ache from typing, and I've followed probably close to every fat liberationist on Instagram. I've read the Fat Liberation Manifesto, which I had previously talked about in the document. It's a very important fat feminist text from 1973, authored by the founding members of the Fat Underground at least a dozen times. I've even held it in my hands, and yet today, I know that if my mother's scientific research on obesity finally came up with the perfect little anti-fat pill, I'd think about taking it. Maybe I'd take it, give right in, and obliterate my own flesh for a chance at feeling accepted. As Lynn Mabel Lois said in the archives, I might just choose to die thin. Murray made me feel less alone in this failure to be unambiguously and constantly proud of my fatness. She told me that it was really so simple as permanently changing one's mind about fatness, as deciding to embrace a politic of fat pride, as flipping the fat switch from hate to love. We would all have done it by now. And identity, normalization, and pathologization would have no bearing. If it were that simple, I wouldn't be haunted by this image of dying thin, an image that inspires both horror and desire. She told me I wasn't a bad fat activist because I hated fat hatred, but also sometimes, in my weakest moments, still hated my fat self. And so that is really the crux of it. It is really teasing out these complex ideas around fat embodiment and using my personal experience of encountering these texts, these archives, as a person who has grown up in a fat body and producing through that really interesting and evocative knowledge about what it means to be embodied. And so I'm continuing this in my GSS honors thesis, Gender and Sexuality Studies, this year, and my senior capstone in history. I wanted to thank the Davidson Research Initiative for funding this project and the Davidson History Department for providing travel funding, and also my current advisors who are working with me on this project, Dr. Melissa Gonzalez, Dr. Maria Fackler, and Dr. Dasha Mortensen. Amazing advisors, and I couldn't do any of this without them. And if you want to contact me about anything related to fat studies, I'm always excited to talk about this work, and this is my email, and I really hope I hear from you all, and I can't wait to meet you in January.